Geoffrey Miller received his doctorate in English language and literature from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And he's currently an associate professor of English at Montclair State University in New Jersey. He specializes in the study of Renaissance or early modern literature, history, and theology. His work has attracted international scholarly and media attention, most notably with his announcement in 2015 of his discovery of what is now the King James Bible's earliest known draft. In 2018, he was awarded multiple year-long fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities to support his research. And more recently in 2019, and this is pretty amazing, he was named a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellow or Genius Grant recipient, which makes him the first scholar of early modern English literature to receive this honor in more than a quarter century. His writing has been published in the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, the Times Literary Supplement, Milton Studies, and Milton Quarterly, among other venues, and collections featuring his work have won Best Academic Journal Special Issue Award from the Council of Editors of Learned Journals and the Irene Samuel Memorial Award from the Milton Society of America for the most distinguished collection of essays pertaining to the study of Milton. Discussions of his work have also appeared in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Guardian, and in the Telegraph, in addition to other print and news outlets around the world, such as MSNBC. Miller is currently in the process of completing several book projects. First, an exploration of early modern theological typology and the volatile, sometimes transformative effect it could have on early modern writers in conjunction with the writing process itself, entitled Signifying Shadows, Early Modern Typology, Milton, and the Writer's Mind at Work. A second book-length edition and study of the King James Bible is now earliest known draft that he identified, which is entitled Drafting the King James Bible, the earliest known draft of the most enduring English translation, and a third project, which is a co-edited first full critical edition in more than 125 years of John Selden's Table Talk, which is one of the 17th century's most famous and enigmatic works. Miller has also recently been involved in a number of digital humanities projects, most notably in digital humanities project with Cambridge University Library related to his discovery of the King James Bible draft. And yes, as I mentioned, he is also involved in excuse me, developing other projects connected to this work. So it is actually, since Jeff Miller is our esteemed guest here, in addition to my wonderful colleagues at Northeastern, I wanted to give you a sense of how lucky we are to be here speaking with him today and how grateful we are to have him join us. Next, we'll hear from Erika Boeckler, who's an assistant professor of English at Northeastern, whose work spans multiple genres and disciplines from Shakespeare, early modern poetry, and history of the book to 16th century German art history and early Slavic print culture. Her book, Playful Letters, a study in early modern alphabetics, appeared from the University of Iowa Press in 2017, and she is currently at work on a project called Writing Things, that considers how literary forms influence material forms and vice versa, a chiasmus that foregrounds this inquiry into how writing and its media collide in such a way as to alter both. A parallel book project shaped by feminist and anti-racist bibliography examines the poetics of typography and visual features, such as printers' devices and pictorial type of early modern books. She has received numerous fellowships from institutions that include the Wellesley Newhouse Center for the Humanities, the Huntington Library in California, and the Folger Shakespeare Library. She'll be speaking with David Medina, who is a doctoral candidate in the English department at Northeastern, and also an assistant professor in the Department of Literature at Mass Bay Community College. His research centers on the literature and cultures of the early Americas, and his dissertation project, and I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Amores Amoxley, that's my best attempt, investigates the role of bibliographic objects in the production of colonial authority and culture. And finally, we'll be hearing from our respondent, Ryan Cordell, who is Associate Professor of English at Northeastern. His scholarship seeks to illuminate how technologies of production, reception, and mediation shape meaning of texts within communities. Cordell primarily studies circulation and reprinting in 19th century American newspapers, but his interests extend to the influence of computation and digitization on contemporary reading, writing, and research. As a core founding member, a faculty member in the new lab for text, maps, and networks, Cordell collaborates with his colleagues in English, history, and computer science on NEH and ACLS funded, the NEH and ACLS funded Viral Text Project, which uses robust data mining tools to discover borrowed texts across large-scale archives of 19th century periodicals. Cordell is also a primary investigator in the Digging into Data project, Oceanic Exchanges, which is a 6-nation effort examining patterns of information flow across national and linguistic boundaries in 19th century newspapers. And finally, Cordell is a senior fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. So I think it's going to be a really great panel. I'm going to stop talking so that we can just have this really wonderful conversation. And without further ado, Jeff Miller.
Thanks so much to Sari, Erika, David, Ryan, Gabby, to the wonderful Northeastern Humanities Center for including me in this discussion, and to everyone out there in the ether for making time to attend today. It's really, really exciting for me to be here, even if here means only over Zoom. So I will just go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this works, and then we can go. That seems to be working. Yes, perfect. Okay. Much of the most important innovative work in textual studies in recent decades, perhaps especially in my own primary field of Renaissance or early modern studies, has been conducted under the auspices of the vital, twin, and frequently entwined interdisciplinary fields of the so-called history of the book and the history of reading. Within the context of this brilliant interdisciplinary landscape, however, there exists at least the prospect of a third related, but crucially, I would argue, not coterminous, field that has yet comparatively received much less of its proper due. And that is the field Jacques Derrida referred to as the history of writing. In his majestic essay, Freud and the Scene of Writing, which first appeared in print in 1966, and which Derrida, in a characteristic touch that should not be confused for modesty, described as representing but the fragment of a lecture, Derrida spoke of the history of writing as, quote, an immense field in which only preparatory work has been done up to now. Yet as recently as 2016, the early modernist Juliet Fleming still felt able to identify the history of writing, or what she prefers to term cultural graphology, as remaining a kind of, quote, ghost discipline, now more than half a century after Derrida first published Freud and the Scene of Writing, and it has been suggested himself abandoned the idea of fully pursuing such a field of study. By no means would I want to imply that the history of writing, whether within early modern textual studies or more broadly, has been quite as spectral as Fleming intimates. I could basically spend the rest of my time here crying up the work of scholars who, some explicitly, some not, have made a battery of interventions in any would-be history of writing worthy of the name. Since time is short, however, I'll content myself with mentioning only the recent ongoing work of Anne Blair on scribes within the ambit of early modern studies, and the work of Sally Bushell on genetic criticism and, quote, text as process outside of early modern studies. Still, the underlying point that the history of writing has been much less central in textual studies in recent decades than has either the history of the book or the history of reading holds true. And this has had consequences, I would argue, not just for the enduringly nascent history of writing, but for the interdisciplinary study of the humanities at large. In my own primary field of early modern studies, for instance, I've become increasingly interested in the way that a more prominent focus on the history of writing could help to recover a more dynamic sense of the role that the writing process itself played in shaping the development of early modern authors' works, thoughts, and beliefs, rather than viewing writing as having always been a vehicle merely for expressing or representing a thought already had by the writer or already in circulation in the wider culture. As part of a splendid new biography of John Milton, for example, just published this past dread year of 2020 by the literary scholar Nicholas McDowell, and attempting to chronicle Milton's intellectual development, or quote, the development of Milton's mind, McDowell at one point commends approaching the challenge of writing the intellectual life of a poet like Milton from the perspective of the education, the reading, the society, and the intellectual experiences which shaped his mind. Without denying the importance of those things McDowell mentions, though, it is striking for writing itself, not solely as a textual object subject to literary interpretation, as McDowell frames it, but as an action, event, or process recurrently undertaken by Milton, every bit as much as reading was, to be absented from that summary litany of what could have shaped the mind of one of the most important and indefatigable writers in English literary history. On one level, that the process of writing could have been, for early modern writers, a vehicle as much or more for generating and transforming thought as it was simply for expressing it, should not come altogether as a surprise. It has long been axiomatic in modern composition studies that writing is thinking, not thought recorded, that writing is, quote, not merely the process of putting ideas into visible language, but rather something that itself generates ideas. So too have leading scholars in early modern studies long been aware of this reality, at least when discussing their own writing. In a new 2005 edition of his landmark Renaissance Self-Fashioning, Stephen Greenblatt recalls of the process of composing his formative study that I, quote, believed then and now that only in the act of writing can one discover what one needs to say. Neither was the capacity for writers to think through the process of writing, sometimes even to the point of outright changing their own minds on a topic, a phenomenon about which early modern figures themselves were unaware or silent. In the early modern period, perhaps the most famous story told of a writer changing his mind about something, and with respect to a matter of great import at the time, no less, involved the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius, shown here. Arminius became notorious in his day for coming to reject the Calvinist doctrine of absolute predestination, and Arminius's brand of anti-Calvinist teaching on this point and others flowing out from it would ultimately grow to be known as Arminianism as a result. At Arminius's own funeral, however, it was reported that Arminius had in effect only become an Arminian through the process of composing a work wherein he had initially intended to defend against an attack that had been made on it, the doctrine of absolute predestination espoused not just by Calvin, but by Calvin's own exalted successor in Geneva, Theodore Beza, under whom Arminius had personally trained. Arminius therefore set himself to the work of writing that intended defense of Calvinist doctrine, the story told at Arminius's funeral went. But while he undertakes the refutation, sed dum molitor refutationem, while he weighs the arguments on each side, while he considers the scriptures, while he tortures and wearies himself, he was overcome by the truth in question in this case being the anti-Calvinist position that thereafter Arminius constantly maintained all the way to the end of his life. Milton, for one, would go on to recall this episode in his great defense of the freedom of the press, Areopagitica of 1644, describing it as, quote, not forgot how the acute and distinct Arminius had come to change his mind about predestination in the process of endeavoring to respond in writing to a work which at first he took in hand to confute, assailing the Calvinist teaching on the subject. Yet while Arminius may have thus supplied the most indelible example in the early modern period of something having been changed about an author or her or his work in and through the process of composing a given text, one can find all sorts of other testaments to the phenomenon throughout the era, at large and small. Here, for instance, is the radical Puritan Thomas Cartwright openly affirming in one of his own most controversial works from the later 16th century that, in the course of writing it, I changed my mind, at least about one matter. Or here is John Bunyan in his justly famous prefatory poem to the Pilgrim's Progress, attesting over 100 years later that when at the first I took my pen in hand thus for to write, he had undertook to make another kind of book. Yet in the course of writing it, he fell suddenly, Bunyan says of himself, into composing an allegory, such as the Pilgrim's Progress became. And with the work thenceforth seeming to multiply like sparks that from the coals of fire do fly, as he wrote it, until it came at last to be for length and breadth the bigness which you see. In spite of these kinds of statements from the early modern period, and what the experience of manifold writers today, from students to professional scholars, might similarly lead one to anticipate, with reference to the potentially transformative effect on writers that the very process of writing a work could have on them. There remain, however, a variety of reasons why this aspect of early modern writing has not tended to be as much of a factor in scholarly considerations of the period as it might have been. One reason, which I won't dwell on today, is theoretical, related to the way that a number of the controlling theoretical paradigms for conducting historicist, text-centered work in early modern studies have tended to exclude the capacity for the writing process itself to exert this dramatic form of influence on a writer in the course of a work's own composition. Another reason, though, stems from a perception of bedrock archival limitations, a belief in a sort of absence of evidence that has been tough to shake. Specifically, it has been suggested by no less a book historian than Roger Chartier, among others, that the kind of so-called genetic criticism upon which a recovery or analysis of the dynamic nature of the writing process might appear to rest, whereby a scholar would be able to go from the study of, quote, what has been written to writing, from structure to process, from the work to its genesis, end quote, simply may not be possible for periods before the mid-18th century, due to a dearth of authorial drafts and other such compositional material surviving in the archives from before that time. It's this idea that much of my recent work has been aimed at redressing, at least in part. And it's this that I want to reflect on in the time I have left in terms of possible new directions in textual studies and book history. One thing to say for starters is that more archival materials deserving to be recognized as drafts do in fact survive from the early modern period than has been commonly supposed. Take the case of the drafts that went into the making of the King James Bible, first published in 1611 and still the most widely read work of English writing in the history of the language. In 2015, I announced the discovery of what now stands as the earliest known draft of any part of the King James translation, and the only extant draft of the work yet identified definitively in the hand of one of the work's own translators. The draft was not discovered, however, lost or languishing in a musty archive backroom or in someone's attic, as the Hollywood depictions of these things sometimes run. Rather, the manuscript notebook in which the draft appears had been carefully preserved in the archives of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, not least by their splendid, indispensable archivist Nicholas Rogers, and had been cataloged by a specialist as recently as 1985. The manuscript, though, had been cataloged as containing a verse-by-verse biblical commentary on an unknown portion of the Bible, as opposed to a draft translation of part of the Bible itself. And yet again, this had been done not out of ignorance or incompetence, but precisely because at first or even second blush, a kind of verse-by-verse biblical commentary is what the draft most resembles. It is only when recalling that the King James translators were explicitly ordered not to compose an entirely new translation of the Bible, but were instead ordered merely to revise a previous English translation known as the Bishop's Bible, and to do so as little as possible, that the draft's true identity as such snaps into focus. And I'm displaying on the screen one of the extant manuscript copies of these rules for composing the King James Bible that the translators received, where the order to follow the Bishop's Bible is listed first and foremost. In the draft, written throughout in the hand of one of the King James translators named Samuel Ward, shown here, one finds Ward crafting what would become part of the King James translation of the text by way of proposing a long series of revisions to the Bishop's Bible's translation, proceeding verse by verse, often phrase by phrase. At one point, early in the draft of the Old Testament apocryphal book known as First Esdras, for example, Ward suggests revising the opening of the Bishop's Bible's translation of First Esdras 1:2. The word stasos in the extant Greek of the verse, which the Bishop's Bible had translated as he set, Ward proposed should instead be given as having set. And when one turns to the King James Bible as it appeared in 1611, one sees that this is exactly what was done. At other points in the draft, Ward's proposed revisions could be far more sweeping in nature, leading Ward to attempt to retranslate whole chunks of a verse, constructing a revision to the Bishop's Bible's rendering of the lamentably misogynistic First Esdras 4:26, for instance. Ward wrote out a revised version of the verse in its entirety. Even in this case, though, one can see Ward approaching the work of composing the King James translation still as a process of revision. Ward begins with the Bishop's Bible's translation of the verse at issue, rather than starting afresh with the verse's underlying Greek, and he leaves intact the Bishop's Bible's own wording where he can, even as other segments of the verse become rewritten altogether. There's lots to be said about what Ward's draft reveals with respect to the wider process of crafting the King James Bible, including the way Ward's draft vividly depicts him thinking through the process of composing the draft, making mistakes, changing his mind, working things out, in a manner wholly unlike what one finds in the few other and tellingly later drafts of the King James Bible that have ever come to light. Here's another good example on the slide of Ward wrestling with the syntax of a particularly thorny verse. A tree, he begins writing, but then crosses it out. No, out of he starts writing on second thought, but then crosses that out too. For the purposes of this talk, though, the crucial point is the way Ward's draft both shows the need and provides an opportunity for rethinking preconceptions about what a draft of a given work in the early modern period might resemble in the first place. The better, among other things, to be able to identify further such drafts in the future. It is a striking fact that each of the precious few drafts of the King James Bible yet to be uncovered, very much including Ward's draft, has at some point in its history been identified as something else. If one has only an ill-fitting notion of what a draft might constitute, then one will be habitually overlooking or discounting objects of more heterodox shape on the basis of their failure to squeeze into an anachronistically round hole. I'm also interested, however, in exploring the ways that the writing process itself might have shaped the development of works and their authors during the early modern period in cases where we do lack key manuscript evidence of the process. And here is where some of the preoccupations of my work start to differ somewhat from the governing focus on extant compositional materials found in much genetic criticism or the French tradition of la critique génétique. Consider John Milton's great unfinished theological treatise De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine. Milton worked on this treatise feverishly over a period of years, even decades, with an especially intensive stretch of labor on the text coming after he went fully blind in the early 1650s, with Milton relying on a complex network of scribes and amanuenses to aid him. To make a long story short, in the course of repeatedly revising and re-revising the text of his De Doctrina, Milton and his assistants would often have clean new copies of pages produced after they had accrued a welter of revision. This is not something Milton evidently did only after he went blind, I should note. Here, for example, is a case of the young Milton in his own handwriting, preparing a clean second draft of one of his most well-known letters, before then coming to make further revisions to the second draft of the letter as well. Yet when it came to De Doctrina, in all but one fascinating instance shown here, the heavily revised pages of the text, once they had been recopied, were then discarded, thereby rendering irretrievably lost to history all evidence of the composition process behind them, or so one might think. One of the things I've tried to show, however, is that it still remains possible, albeit with some amount of speculation entailed, to reconstruct aspects of these lost manuscript pages on the basis of the clean manuscript copies of them that do survive, and that when one does this, surprising discoveries can be made. For example, I've been able to prove with some amount of certainty that this paragraph found in the middle of a chapter in De Doctrina appears to represent something that Milton added to the chapter very late, propelling a series of further late revisions to the text, as Milton wrestled in writing with the full implications of the change. Lastly, and perhaps most fancifully, though there are times I think maybe most excitingly too, I've also attempted to do something similar with respect to printed works from the period, for which survive, to our knowledge, none of the manuscript drafts that went into their making, as in the case of Milton's The Reason of Church Government of 1642, where I've tried to show that one can watch Milton changing his mind about the whole central thesis of the tract, moment by moment, in the process of his writing the work. So what are some of the upshots of all this in terms of new directions in textual studies and book history? For now, by way of a quick conclusion, I'll confine myself to two. though I'm happy to elaborate further on such possible new directions in the Q&A after the panel. One concerns archival possibilities, encouraging us to rethink not just what may yet survive in archives, still awaiting discovery, but what might also constitute an archive. By better learning to read, that is to say, the archival materials that do survive, both print and manuscript, as a kind of palimpsestic archive in themselves of the admittedly often lost drafts that stand behind them, we not only might find fresh discoveries waiting to be made regarding the prospective history of writing, but might further enrich the possibilities of archival research more broadly. Second, and here I'll end, there are ways that new advances in the digital humanities open up opportunities both to conduct this kind of research and to share it with other scholars, students, and a wider public more than ever previously conceivable. Imagine, for example, an edition of the King James Bible's first edition, of which, not unrelatedly, there has never been a modern scholarly edition, where for a given verse, and here I'll use as an illustration 2 Samuel 1:19, which in the King James Bible contains the indelible phrase not found in prior English renderings of the verse, "How are the mighty fallen?" The reader could choose to see a clean, edited version of the passage with original spelling and punctuation, or modernized, and could then click to see a visual representation of the revisions to the bishop's Bible that gave rise to the verse, and could then choose to see the various other prior or parallel English translations of the verse still embedded within the King James Bible's rendering, and could then see how the passage appears in any drafts of the King James Bible that we possess for the verse's composition, where in this case it is notable that the most famous aspect of what would become the King James Bible's rendering is not present, and could then choose to compare in the form of the great polyglot Bibles of the early modern period itself, the King James translation of the verse alongside the passage's manifestation in the ancient versions of the biblical text underlying it in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and so forth, with a particular focus on the various editions of these ancient versions that the King James translators actually used in their work, and all without necessitating the production or purchase of a print edition that would be roughly 1 million pages long and would probably cost just about as many dollars to acquire. The time is especially ripe to explore the full range of possibilities for how we engage with texts like the King James Bible in relation to the history of their writing, not least because the digital humanities has helped to make it so. Thanks so much, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that fascinating talk and look at one of the most important early modern texts and beyond of all time in the West. And thank you again so much, Professor Altschuler and the Humanities Center for inviting me to this exciting conversation, and to the tech coordinator, Gabriella Fiorenza. David and I are going to respond just briefly, more directly to the title of the panel before we each give an individual presentation. And I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint here if I can find it. Sorry, suddenly it seems to have disappeared from my screen. That's weird. There it is. Okay, does that look right?
Let's see. Yeah, good to go.
Everybody can see that? Okay. Just a brief, quick correction on the verbal intro. I'm actually associate professor of English here at Northeastern.
Sorry about that.
No problem. We're going to talk a little bit about how book history is grappling with its role in colonization, how it's reckoning with how the profession has centered and promoted the interests and goals of a white patriarchal colonizing ideology, we and our work and the work of others look at how whose interests have been represented and how those are reflected in the materials, methodologies, topics of study, the makeup of the professoriate, the gatekeeping systems such as archives, publishing, and funding, and so forth. David and I will be talking about what material forms are privileged and why and what has been left out. I think, David, feel free to jump in and add to this overview.
Yeah, like Erika said, the decolonial shift in book history is kind of operating at two levels. On the one hand, the scholarship itself is asking those big questions like who's represented, whose story is being told, why is there always a certain kind of subjectivity that's always at the center or at the default. But also, again, at the institutional level, as Erika mentioned, there's this move towards international, multilinguistic, multiracial networks of understanding book history and understanding our archives, which is all an effort in service of decolonizing the discipline at both the disciplinary level and the scholarship level. Part of what I'll talk about once I get to my section of the presentation is the anthropology of the book, which is partly asking these questions about the dynamic between non-human objects and human subjects. So by thinking about like human and non-human networks, we can ask bigger questions about the anthropology of the book and ask fun questions like things, for example, like what does it mean to look at a book as a sort of extended phenotype for a culture, or a way that a culture uses objects to announce itself.
Along those lines, we'll just give a quick run-through, a brief run-through of some of these points. Along those lines, the eco-critical approaches to book history have integrated not just sort of humans, but also the ways in which the book is, or texts, I should say, are enmeshed in natural ecosystems, and the ways in which they represent and offer traces of human material, plant and animal interactions. I'm thinking of Josh Calhoun's recent book, The Nature of the Page, or even my work here at Northeastern on the Dragon Prayer Book Project, the only medieval manuscript owned by Northeastern. We've done an analysis of a peptide analysis of the animal skin on which it's written, and discovered that it's made out of cows, something we couldn't have figured out before. So we've got great, wonderful new tools for thinking broadly, opening up questions about books and book history, while at the same time we're continuing to re-examine, as Jeff has done, the material culture surrounding the book itself. David, maybe you
and on that note, it's not just books, but it's also other bibliographic objects. That's a kind of a term that a lot of scholars interested in this kind of like new burgeoning field of decolonial book history have used. But the word itself, bibliographic object, brings our attention to things that are not printed, things like Mesoamerican codices, codicology, but expanding our idea of what can be included in the realm of book history and what book history can bring to bear on other meaning-making objects is also part of this new shift that some recent scholars in the past like 10, 20 years have really done a great job of expanding and solidifying as being part of the book history field.
I'll
quickly talk about the archival sensorium. So in part of my presentation, I'll talk about how, in addition to expanding our notions of what is included in this idea of text and this idea of bibliology, there's also this kind of shift where we are starting to consider the olfactory, the haptic, the sonic, the ephemeral kind of fleeting experiences of books that you might experience either as a reader or as a reader in the archive. So things like, the book being covered with a certain oil to enhance its, pleasurability as you're reading it. That's a thing that happened in 16th century Mesoamerica. And this is, again, just another way of thinking about these bigger questions of like, how does a book announce itself, either to a culture, to a subject, and so on.
and to the researcher in the archive. Now, I'm going to transition into my specific presentation, which looks at race in the margins of Shakespeare's Othello. And oops, I am sorry, it's missing things. So I'm gonna talk about parts of the book that are often ignored. So this is an English printer's ornament called a headpiece because it appears atop opening pages, and we saw some of those in Jeff's presentation. Printers' ornaments have received very little critical attention because they are very numerous, mostly not cataloged, can exist in many similar copies, can move between printers without any apparent rhyme or reason, and usually seem to appear in text because they are the right size and not because of any connection to the content, or it's what the printer had at hand. Even the name ornament suggests that they are merely decorative rather than integral to textual content. But they also offer an unfolding story of the relationships between early modern printers of aesthetic currents coursing internationally and locally. And as I will be discussing, how gender and race are recruited by printers to visually comment on the text they print. Bibliographers have generally insisted on the separation of such paratextual features from the text proper. That is to say, they insist that these were part of a work's bibliographic code and not its linguistic one. Book historians have chipped away at this distinction made by Jerry McGann in the early 90s. Since printers' ornaments are also often the only pictures that appear in early modern texts, I find this ups the stakes for considering how they may guide us in thinking about how printers' visual designs shaped readers' experiences of textual content. And the best argument, I think, for paying attention to the image stock of printers is that these ornaments are intentionally designed to be shocking or interesting and draw the eye. And once the eye is there, the image rewards sustained looking. The longer you look, the more tiny, surprising details emerge. Anyone who opens the first printed text of Shakespeare's play Othello from 1622 is struck by the large, conspicuously empty oval cartouche within the large and elaborate headpiece that greets readers on its first 2 pages after the title page. This headpiece makes for a useful test piece to consider how the bibliographic and linguistic codes operate collaboratively. For the first page in which it appears is the prefatory letter by Thomas Walkley. Oops, back to that. The book's publisher and seller. The second page is the text of the play proper. In short, it visually links the investments of the publisher with the words of the play. As we look closely at the 2 grotesques in the Q1 ornament, we see male and female human heads, bird claws, and an uncertain torso, either contained by or consisting of some conch-shaped Baroque machinery. They are stock characters typical of the antique style, now called grotesque or early Mannerist, that had its roots in the school of French graphic designer Geoffrey Torry. The female head is the noble lady trope, here noticeably less shaded than the male. The male is the satyr. Douglas Brewster describes these ornaments in the antique style as a paradoxical mix of the low and high, comic and serious, grotesque and elite, usually framing a central figure of mythopoetic origins, such as a satyr, a ram or goat, regal lady, or bearded green man, in a balanced but not mirrored arrangement of vines, flowers, cornucopias, and attendant creatures. Why here is the central cartouche empty? Why doesn't one of these heads appear there? So for those of you who don't know the play Othello, here's a little background. He's a general in the Venetian army who the play codes as other and black. At this time, race was not defined exclusively or even primarily by skin color, but also through geographic origin, religious practices, clothing, eating habits, and other cultural habits. Ayanna Thompson, Cord Whittaker, and other early modern and medieval race scholars call this race before race. It's a time when Western European contemporary notions of white racial identity were forming against visually marked religious, geographic, and cultural others. The more Othello is caught within the shifting discourse, which is highlighted in his elopement with the upper-class Venetian white woman Desdemona. Although the marriage is socially accepted, he is fed fake news about her fidelity by a trusted fellow Italian Venetian soldier, Iago, and ultimately ends up smothering Desdemona and then taking his own life after the truth is revealed. I want to suggest that the headpiece invites readers to contemplate these images as potentially representative of the play's character dynamics. Does Desdemona appear as the noble lady, transformed through her awakened sexual desire into a female harpy, an icon of dangerous female sexuality and appetite? Situated opposite to Desdemona, the satyr evokes Othello. The play codes him again as other, foreign, darker, subject to lust, feminized in the harpy figure, as was often the case for Renaissance England's Moors and Turks. These are bodies that white male Renaissance writers struggle to understand, and both are depicted as hybrid creatures. But like the play, this headpiece does not offer an overly facile view of Othello. One of its signature moves is to set up racial stereotypes that sound familiar to audiences now, but it does not permit them to sediment. Othello is culpable, but he is also a victim to the machinations of Iago. Othello suggests himself that Iago is the cloven-footed devil, like the satyr, noting, "I look down towards his feet, but that's a fable. If thou beest a devil, I cannot kill thee." Across the street from Northeastern at the MFA, the Black artist Fred Wilson's 2009 dark glass sculpture entitled Iago's Mirror uses the first quarto's central empty cartouche to read the complicated relationship between Iago and Othello. Is Othello Iago's mirror? Is the piece a mirror for Iago's black soul? Or is it a mirror for the piece's viewers? Sometimes early modern printers or individual readers would add their names or initials to empty cartouches. Returning to the 1622 text, on both pages, this oval cartouche appears above a letter O. In the stationer's letter, it appears above the word to. At the start of the drama, it recalls the O in Othello in a repeat of the title that prefaces the first stage direction. One has to work to not read the cartouche alphabetically, an icon of the overwhelming preponderance of O's that dot the entire playtext and seem to take their cues from the double O's in Othello and more. And other keyword, and there are many other key double O words like book, blood, good, sooty, proof, look, fool, poor, woo, food. To close the book would compact these O pages atop each other in an imaginative, deep regressive whole. That deep regression is repeated elsewhere visually in the text, particularly in the climactic grammar of Othello's anguished cry, typeset as "O Desdemona, Desdemona, dead, oh, oh, oh." The parallel poetic line to the "O Desdemona" wail is Othello's "Arise, black vengeance from the hollow hell," a phrase anticipating Othello's no going back oath of vengeance, but which appears in the Othello printing that came out 1 year later. The hollow hell is an acoustic anagram of Othello's name. But in Q1, this line is "Arise, black vengeance from thy hollow cell." Are the two strikingly hollow O cells on the first 2 pages of this printed text glossing this line? One direction I am taking book history is the study of how discourses of race and gender are forged on the margins of printed texts, sometimes in conversation with the alphabetic content of a work, and sometimes as a separate parallel discourse. Okay, and David, hand it over to you.
Yeah, let me get my presentation started. I'll quickly preface by saying thank you all for inviting me to this talk, and thank you, Gabby, for putting this all together. I know it's not easy organizing all the stuff behind the scenes. Let's see, hopefully you can see my screen, Modus and Moxley, the title page here. Hopefully you all can see that, I'm hoping. Okay.
Looks great, yeah.
Great. So there's a lot of jargon. I'm happy to kind of like answer more questions about some of these terms towards the end. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm gonna try to get through some of the more kind of salient points that I want to talk about today, but I'm just gonna jump into it. So one of the more recent trends in book history has been the call to study relationships between early American colonialism and the history of the book. While literary scholars and book historians have produced compelling and engaging research at this intersection, few studies have adequately acknowledged the role of indigenous bibliographic objects, such as Mesoamerican screenfolds and lienzos, whose facsimiles are featured here. So this is kind of where my dissertation project intervenes. When indigenous bibliographic objects are included in discussions of colonial mediascapes, there are possibilities for understanding cultural syncretism, textual hybridity, bibliographic appropriation. Those things are often dismissed in pursuit of causal claims about how Spanish superiority, things like guns, steel, and printing presses, contributed to their eventual domination in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in Mesoamerica. So some scholarship on early colonial textual studies and book history, such as that done by Heather J. Allen, Elizabeth Hill Boone, Jorge Canizares Esguerra, all these scholars have done well to advance our understanding of Mesoamerican mediascapes, but much of their path-breaking work emphasizes the role of alphabetic writing and other semiotic systems. Elizabeth Hill Boone, for example, who has greatly advanced our understanding of Mesoamerican and Andean systems of writing, focuses almost entirely on structures of semasiographic writing and leaves much to be said about what Jerome McGann has called the bibliographic codes of material production. While important inroads have been made into the study of indigenous writing systems, much work remains to be done on the role of material substrates and the impact of sensorial and performative elements that accompanied the use of Mesoamerican bibliographic objects in the 16th and 17th century. Advancing our understanding of the material and the sensorial, as I argue throughout my dissertation, can greatly advance our understanding of the dialectical relationship between the competing codex cultures of the 16th and 17th centuries. So in its broadest sense, my dissertation is interested in kind of pushing the boundaries of book history a little bit and advancing the argument that Mesoamerican codex culture, which includes haptic, sonic, performative, and embodied elements, was not, as the Americanist Robert Ricard once claimed, quote, an inferior system incapable of resisting a unilateral spiritual conquest. Rather, Mesoamerican codex culture was seen by Spanish colonial agents as a viable and thus threatening system for creating, preserving, and disseminating information. So there's a quote in particular, the English translation is here on the slide. Todo lo tenían pintado, the Dominican friar Diego Duran writes, en libros y largos papeles con cuentas de años, meses y días en que habían acontecido sus leyes y ordenanzas, todo con mucho orden y concierto. Thus, to better assess this history of competing communication systems, my project views codex cultures, be they European, indigenous, hybrid, what have you, as existing in entangled states with one another. This reorientation provides insight into how bibliographic objects, which is a term I use throughout the work to denote pretty much anything, printed European books, indigenous pictographic codices, and hybrid documents like the Codex Sierra and the Florentine Codex, how these things functioned in the colonial contact zones of Mesoamerica. I'm mindful of the time here, so I'm just going to try to like skip through some of this really quickly. The project is essentially trying to ask these large overarching questions. So throughout the chapters, I ask how, for example, do different media objects and mediascapes become social and political facts? How did colonial indigenous societies understand the relation between information technologies and social power? And how did different groups in 16th and 17th century Mesoamerica understand their own codex culture? So to better assess these questions about entangled technologies of text and competing codex cultures, I borrow methods from the cognitive philosopher Andy Clark, who uses a theory of extended minds to help us understand how human cognition is, quote, always supported by and working in conjunction with various technological infrastructures. Additionally, the work of Eileen Joy and Jeffrey Cohen, who both argue that cognition and agency are, quote, collective affairs, part of a distributed system that intermixes the human and the object, also feeds into my underlying approach and the ways that I make sense of the literary and bibliographic objects at the heart of the study here. So I'll quickly say a little bit about the title. My larger idea about like entangled technologies of text and a focus on object-centric book history is best captured in the project's title, Amores a Moxley. The title itself pairs the Spanish term for desire, amores, with a moxley, the Nahua word for a painted codex. This juxtaposition does the work of the dissertation in miniature. It situates European fetishism for bibliographic objects within indigenous codex cultures. The fear of non-living objects overpowering or dominating the wills of living subjects, that played deeply into 16th century fears and subsequent colonial and state-sponsored efforts to extirpate, usually by burning, Mesoamerican idols, religious centers, and codices. Taken as a whole, my project borrows momentum from the material turn in the humanities. It seeks to use the some bibliographic methods to better understand the role of bibliographic objects and codex cultures in colonial literature. Super mindful of the time, so instead of talking about all the chapters, I'll just kind of give you the first two chapters, and then I'm happy to talk about some of this stuff afterwards. But chapter 1 is called Con mucho orden y concierto, which is a line taken from a Dominican friar named Diego Duran's large work about Nahua history and culture. But in this chapter, I'm basically interested in exploring within the contact zones of 16th century Mesoamerica, the role of bibliographic objects. Some of the mendicants, basically some of like the orders like the Franciscans, Augustinians, Dominicans, they are hyper obsessed with bibliographic objects, particularly indigenous bibliographic objects, and are constantly making comments about how amate substrate, which is used for indigenous codices, how that stuff is so much brighter, so much more resilient. So again, this is all just to say that far from seeing indigenous communication systems as inferior or under-evolved, many Spanish colonial agents, in particular the mendicants, saw these objects as a threat to their colonial hegemony and their ability to perpetuate the evangelical projects. So that's a little bit of what chapter 1 gets into. I partly explore the hybridity that comes towards the end of the first cycle of conquest. So, 1550 to 1570, there's this interesting hybridity where Nahua pictographic kind of images are being integrated into Western European printing technologies. But again, this chapter is just to show that kind of original syncretism, hybridity, that competition, and the understanding of different codex cultures from different perspectives in this time period. Chapter 2 is one that is still kind of in the works, without a doubt, but it investigates the relationship between books and bodies, primarily by way of looking at these marcas de fuego, which are literal firebrands. So a lot of late 16th century mendicants, but specifically the Franciscans and some Jesuits, were using firebrands as a way to show possession of their bibliographic objects. So firebrands could be found, pretty much in almost any kind of Franciscan community. But these same firebrands were often used to mark the bodies of indigenous laborers to show that they belonged to a certain encomienda or a certain kind of tributary system. So the way books and bodies are treated opens up some interesting questions that chapter 2 digs into. But towards the end of chapter 2, I'm interested in exploring something that a lot of us know about, the burning of Mesoamerican codices, the complete extirpation of these objects. I'm basically making the argument in this chapter that the removal of these objects perpetuates this phenomenon that I call undocumentation, which is sort of a way of thinking about it, is kind of understanding a culture being tarred, physically marked with an absence of something. So in this case, an absence of books, an absence of history and codex culture, which is then, of course, used to build other Spanish colonial systems of power and so on. So there's other chapters that I could gladly talk about. I'm super mindful that we've already killed an hour somehow, so I'm happy to take other questions. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. So my talk is a challenge to take me seriously while there's a giant stack of stuffed animals over my shoulder. I'm going to keep things really short because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And I've got the fortunate job of just being able to sort of respond and try and kind of kick off the conversation. But I did, as I was reading these talks, and particularly, reading Professor Miller's talk initially, I had a quote that came to mind, and I'm going to pop it up real quick here. Any of my students, I know some of my students are here, they'll know this quote. They will have seen it in my classes before. And it's from Ben Franklin's autobiography. So I've got it up. Hopefully folks can see it now. There's this moment where he's reflecting back on one of the printers that he worked for as a younger man. And he's talking about that printer as a poet, as being a poet, Keimer. But he says that, and you can read it in front of you, but to paraphrase a little bit, he says that Keimer couldn't really be said to write poetry because he composed it in type directly out of his head. And so we treat these words now, writing and composing, as rough synonyms, but for Franklin, they're distinct technological operations. So when he talks about writing, he means, hand to paper, putting letter forms down, that's writing. And when he talks about composing, he means assembling movable type in the chase in order to put on the press. These are these distinct activities for him. And so he distinguishes both those technical acts but also from each other, but he also distinguishes those technical acts from the mental act of creating a text, right? So like there's the mental activity, and then there's writing, and there's composing, and these are related, but they're not identical activities. And so as Professor Miller is sort of prompting us to think more about writing for textual studies, I'm wondering how this kind of dichotomy asks us to structure those inquiries. And more broadly, to begin kind of connecting the threads of these talks, I'm wondering how we can better position print, not as this kind of singular technology that dictates literary bibliographic history, but as part of this spectrum of media and media technologies that all get used to create objects that David is calling sort of bibliographic objects as he's talking. To say this another way, Franklin makes this clear distinction between writing and composing that prompts me to be attentive to other media technological distinctions that might have been clearer to the historical people we're studying than they are to us, and that we might risk missing by inattention. And then the last thing I'll say, I have a lot more, but I'm going to cut it short because I want to make sure we have time to talk. I keep getting struck looking at all of these talks and listening to all these talks by a kind of metaphor of focus, because all of the talks are asking us to focus on layers of production outside of the kind of authorized printed edition of the text necessarily. So, sorry, I'm trying to look at my notes here. So we're asked to look at drafts, revisions, manuscripts that are sort of preceding print and that are possibly lost. This palimpsest that we can read and derive new insight from. Professor Boeckler's talk focuses our attention on elements added after writing, right? Added during the printing process and maybe during the composition process. In the print shop that add these additional palimpsestic layers of interpretation kind of on top of what was written. And then David Medina's talk asked us to think about these works that might be completely lost, in which we can only kind of access through the way that they're referenced and talked about in other works, right? So that we have to sort of get at them. And I kept thinking it's almost like the text is sort of like one of those magic eye posters, right? Where you have to unfocus so that you don't see the thing directly in front of you and you see the layers behind it or under it or around it. I'm not sure exactly where the layer that you see when you unfocus your eyes is, but you have to sort of look in a different way. And then that all leads me, I won't say everything, but if we think about sort of traditional bibliography, I was wondering, particularly in Professor Boeckler and David Medina's talks about whether even that term bibliographic objects is still kind of, what do we get by calling all these things bibliographic objects? And is that still like kind of imposing a particular worldview on the objects that maybe we want to back away from a little bit more even? Is that still enforcing a kind of colonial or Western idea of what's valuable onto objects that maybe operate in really different modes? So I summarized my last paragraph really, really quickly, but I hope these begin to get us talking, and that we have time for others to talk as well. And that is where I will stop, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so thank you guys so much. Those were really wonderful, just I think really wonderful and diverse set of approaches to the question of new directions in book history and textual studies. And so I'm extremely excited to hear your questions and comments. We already have one from Ashley Brown in the chat, who's actually one of our wonderful undergraduates. So we'll start with that. And then if you'd like to speak, I think that I have the capability, if you just type RTS in the chat, I think I have the capability of allowing your voice to come through. So if you'd prefer to actually speak the question, we can do that as well. So we'll start with Ashley, who writes, related to Professor Cordell's first question, there appears to be a difference in culture between scribal text and printed text, and I wonder whether those think that the writing process and access to works may be related to all this.
I'm happy to say something about that, but I don't want to necessarily be the first to jump in. But it's an amazing question, and it really relates to so much of the wonderful things that Erika, David, and Ryan all had to say in their contributions to the panel. I mean, one thing, I'm sensitive to not making assumptions about what scribal culture meant across time, because I think it means sometimes it means something different in different periods. Certainly in my own period, I think one of the things that's really exciting about early modern textual studies is that the way that the kind of distinction between a scribal object and a printed object can really blur. So for example, there's been a lot of really important bibliographic work over recent generations that have stressed the way that a scribal book could be published by way of being scribally copied. There's a kind of an old way of thinking about the history of the book as sort of with Gutenberg, you reach the end of the scribally published book, but actually in some ways, Gutenberg just sort of rung changes on that culture without ending it. It's also the case that actually printed books could in a way become themselves scribal objects, not just through annotation, but actually in the writing process itself. So for example, one notable thing about the King James Bible's composition is that it is very possible that all the later drafts of the work, and definitely including the work's lost final draft, which seems to have gone up in flames in the Great Fire of London, it seems like that was an annotated copy, a hand annotated copy of the Bishop's Bible. So in that sense, something that we tend to think of, say, drafts as perforce not being printed objects, but they could be, and we tend to think of scribal things as not being published in that sense, or somehow coming prior to print, but they could be as well. So that's at least something that I find really interesting, that these sort of cultures of print and scribal production can really interpenetrate, at least in my field.
And if I could follow up on that, I think we also need to think broadly about what we mean when we say scribal in the first place, right? Because I look in my other work, I look at poems on combs, poems that were inscribed on combs. Is that scribal culture? Or with the work that you saw today, a lot of those paratextual features are actually taken from model books that were used to create lace work, for embroidery. They have their background, they have a history from the Islamic cultures. So there's a really broad in architecture. So there's a really broad understanding of what is a scribal text in the first place.
Yeah, and I'll quickly say, like, this is one of the things I've been interested in is there's this document in early 16th century colonial Americas called the requerimiento, or the requirement. And it was this document that had to be read aloud to indigenous peoples before conquerors could conquer, basically. And it's an insane document. If you haven't read it, like, go look it up. It's like 3 paragraphs long. But I found one in the archives in Seville in Spain, and it's a really fascinating document because part of what it is it's a printed document, but the requirement, like the thing that had to be read aloud, the ceremony it's scribed in, somebody hand writes it in. So it's this kind of weird thing that, like, does it even matter if it's printed or if it's been produced by a scribe, or does the existence of the object kind of like transcend all of that? But I think, like, some of this is partly just opening up, and like it opens up more complex questions more than anything. But yeah, I think this is something that all of our kind of talks kind of get around or get close to.
We have a comment from Jessica Linker, and she says it's context to the speakers. She has some students on the Zoom who are present and may have read Eisenstein, and then challenges to her argument, and are thinking about book technologies generally. So I don't know if you want to respond to that, if you have thoughts about it, then comment in relation to your own work, or also I know that Ryan offered just an awesome plethora of comments that we didn't have a chance to actually address because we moved right into the questions. So I'll leave the floor open.
I mean, not to sort of go again, but one of the things I find interesting, I mean, I guess sort of broad, sort of take up the sort of question sort of broadly of sort of the technologies of book production and things like that, and with Ryan's point about being careful to historicize elements, so that we tend to think of, oh, I wrote a text, I composed a text, like that's the same thing. Whereas in earlier periods, certainly my period, they weren't necessarily seen as being the same thing. One of the things, it's odd because in some ways I come at the work as I guess something of a historicist myself. So I'm really keen to kind of make certain sorts of historical distinctions and things like that. One of the things I've found actually in doing some of this work on the early modern writing process is that there is a danger actually to kind of over-historicize it to the point of over-alienating the past, and assuming that because, say, in certain works, they will kind of make a distinction between writing or composing, or I sort of wrote it in my head and then wrote it down, to assume that then that must have actually been what they were doing and that they just wrote very differently back at the time. I was actually giving a talk on this about the sort of drafting of the King James Bible at Princeton Theological Seminary. And there was someone in the audience who had been involved with the revision of, I think, the Revised Standard Version. And one of the questions or the comments this person made was he was sort of struck by the sort of surprise that certain early modern scholars had sort of greeted Ward's draft with, that this wasn't what we would have expected a draft of the King James Bible to look like, because his comment was, this is exactly what our drafts of the New Revised Standard Version looked like exactly. And so in a sense, the assumption that people writing a work must have been doing something very different than we would think of it doing it today, I'm keen to sort of resist that as well, even though I think it's important to sort of historicize that people have different conceptions and different practices of writing and composing and different senses of that. The last thing, just to say, like, very quickly, is that I didn't really have a chance to get into it in this talk, but I think there's also an important disability studies component of this that I've become increasingly interested in. And this is the way that, I mean, you can kind of see it actually sort of flickering, even in that Ben Franklin quote about how writing has to mean a certain kind of thing. And therefore, if you can't do that very particular thing, then you must not be able to write at all. And one of the things I think you can see actually even in a lot of modern scholarship on, for example, Milton, someone that I spend a lot of time thinking about, who was blind for an important part of his life when he was writing a number of his most important works. An assumption that because Milton was blind, he must not have been able to read or write, sometimes like at all. Some people, sometimes you will find scholars saying, well, Milton, you have to remember, Milton didn't write Paradise Lost because he dictated it. As if that's, writing must mean using your own hand on your own paper. And one of the things I think you can actually see, I've tried to show in some work, and there's a lot of work that's really, really wonderful work that's being done with this. A young scholar named Erika Dar, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, at Ohio State, doing really interesting stuff on Milton's blind language, is that like Milton is capable in blindness of doing what he would have regarded as writing and reading, attending to things like typographical features of text, punctuation, even in blindness. So I think that, in just as much as we don't want to kind of over alienate the past, in doing that, we also don't want to assume that people who couldn't do certain things that we have taken for granted as meaning, writing or reading or something, they may not have understood those terms in quite as narrow a fashion. There's something, I think there's an important disability studies component of that as well.
I'm super grateful to you for talking about that too, since I invited my students from the Disability and Citizenship seminar to attend, and just to, not to horn in a little bit, but just to say, I think as well, thinking about the lessons that neurodiverse readers have offered us about how just even within time periods, people's understandings of their own practices and how they engage in certain kinds of practices of reading and writing are in fact not the same, even when you're talking about one moment in time and one moment in place, because it turns out that people are different. And so, yeah, I love that approach. Yeah, other responses.
I guess really quickly, I'll just go back to one of Ryan's first comments about the idea of using bibliographic object as our term rather than book or whatever it might be. It's such a great question because it's something I wrestle with, right? Like using the term biblio, just using that kind of root word, I think does kind of imply some kind of Western European, starting point. So when possible, I try to use the word codex. I'm talking about a specific thing that I'm calling the codex, and cultures around that I call codex cultures. But for other things, for other substrates, I use the term bibliographic object all the time. And I wonder, if we do get away from that, how far can we move before we're no longer book historians and we're like media archaeologists, we're in media studies departments, or we're no longer kind of talking about the same thing necessarily, because it gets kind of close. And, this is part of what book history, what's exciting about book history is how multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary it is. But this is something I wrestle with too, is the fact that if you move too far away, you're an anthropologist. You're in a different field entirely. So it's something that I've wrestled with, and I try to get around it just by being as precise as I can with terms like codex or whatever it might be. But I'd be curious if you or maybe even anyone in the audience has maybe an answer to this idea of, should we even be using the term bibliographic objects, or is there something more suited to what we're all doing? It's a huge question and one I don't really have an answer to.
Here's the awkwardness of Zoom, where you don't know whether or not somebody's formulating an answer or would like you to move on to the next question. But maybe we can keep that in mind, and if people want to wrap it into subsequent answers, that would be great too. And Ryan, also, you should feel free to jump in and speak, because I know your response time was cut short, but obviously you're also an expert in this area, which is yeah. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about things. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, but my last question that I asked sort of with David. I mean, I think my inclination, having training as a book historian, is to think, how do we widen the circle of the sort of objects that we include. But yeah, I'm also just conscious of the ways that by using the book as this kind of container and saying, well, that is also a book and that is also a book, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem entirely. And also, obviously, my work is, I work with things like newspapers and periodicals that are also not exactly books, right? But that many of the techniques I've learned from book history and bibliography are useful for analyzing those materials. But sometimes I do wonder if, in fact, I'm more of a media historian than I am a book historian. And so I asked it as a genuine question, hoping for insight, not because I have a theory to expound.
Fantastic. Now I'm the one who's mindful of time. So I think, David, you have a great question here from Hengdu, and maybe I'll just read the two unless Jeff, would you like to speak? I just saw okay.
No.
I just saw you unmute. But there are two questions here from people who haven't gotten a chance to say anything. So Hengdu writes, many thanks to panelists for this thought-provoking series of presentations. I'm deeply fascinated by David Medina's project, but unfortunately need to learn more about its historical context to ask interesting questions, and was wondering whether David could elaborate further on the parallels between books and bodies in the second chapter. And then a question from Bryce Lanham, who asks, considering objects, images, ephemera, etc., as texts or books, I'm curious in what ways the object of the book can inherently hold its own colonial significance. Clearly, by creating a more inclusive environment within this field, opportunities arise for anti-colonial work and broader research, but I'm curious if panelists have encountered instances in which placing the book on its proverbial pedestal has been problematic, and how this may inform or impact the field at large. And this, of course, both these questions have something to do with one another and also continue the conversation. So however, I feel like it's mostly a question to David, but yeah.
I guess, yeah, I'll take Hengdu's question. So part of what I'm hoping to explore in that chapter is the way in which kind of bodies get caught up in the kind of material forms of producing substrates and inks and things that go into like bibliographic production. So again, in a lot of this kind of literature, I mean, it's like you can like time it like clockwork. By the time they're commenting, these mendicants, these colonials are writing about indigenous substrates, specifically the amate paper. They're always commenting on like how much better it is than like Spanish paper. They're saying it's so white, it's so vivid, it's so, you can fold it and nothing happens to it, that kind of stuff. So part of that is like, part of this chapter, the one about the relationship between books and bodies, is looking at the relationship between books and indigenous, forms of labor, putting your body into that kind of labor system or form of production. So it's a terrible time to do archival studies right now, but I'm really hoping like at some point when I can get back into archives to look at substrates. One of the things that like some of our digital humanities tools are really great at doing is like telling us, when something was published, where it was found, but we don't often have anyone doing the work of saying, this is what the substrate is made of. So I'm really hoping to find more amate substrate that was used to either print royal edicts, some of these, there's all these like different like documents that are being produced, but I think part of it, part of understanding it first necessitates understanding labor and where things are coming from and where bodies are in relation to those final objects. And this is also just a way of saying like, eventually I want to write about John Eliot's Indian Bible, because it's kind of the same story of indigenous bodies being used in the print offices. So yeah, hopefully that answers a little bit of what I'm interested there. And I forget the last question.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, Erika, sorry, do you want
to? I could just jump in really quickly to second David's point about the emphasis on materials and labor. We now know that women were involved in the rag raking. That was a laborious process used to create books or paper, or the fact that women were involved in printing has been almost entirely obscured by a focus on male producers of early modern texts. And there's a great new book, Women's Labor and the History of the Book in Early Modern England, which thinks expansively about labor and books and who is producing what where. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I thought both Erika and David's talks, were so exciting, not least because they really, I think, do put pressure, as the question is also suggesting, on what kind of sort of violence can be performed, sometimes even to the point of literal violence, right? By centering the book as something that we call a book, as the primal object in a field. And I think actually one of the things that's interesting in when I think about the early modern period is that it seems like book in general was a very specific thing, so that even whole things that we might regard as books today, they did not. And when, having spent some number of years sucked into doing a bunch of work on the King James Bible, there, in a sense, you're not just doing work on a book, but you're doing work on the book, or at least what many people in the period would have regarded as the book. Not just for religious reasons, but because in lots of societies and places, it might have been the only book that a family owned in their home. There's obviously been a ton of work that's gone into showing the way that the Bible became, specifically the King James Bible, in Anglophone context, became very bound up with acts of colonial repression and oppression, and just providing very important justification for it and things like that. And I think that obviously, in trying to think about, well, where do these objects come from? So, thinking about the history of the writing of the King James Bible, I think that helps to understand where some of the things that would go on to have very important influence on culture, for better or worse, like how do they come to be as they are, but also potentially sort of encouraging us to kind of decenter their kind of monumental form as book, as the focus. I think there might be some good that could come from that, maybe. And then thinking lastly about just translation studies and the drafting of translations. Obviously, there's a sort of particular kind of urgency to this when you're translating a religious text like the Bible. But the way that translation at once acts as a means of greater dissemination, right? So people who can't read or understand, if heard, language A will now be able to engage with text as soon as we move it into language B. But in the process of moving language from language A to language B, there's also a kind of erasure that can go on there. And where even, as happened with the King James Bible, in certain cultures, the King James Bible came to replace any other version of the Bible as, in a sense, the divine word of the Bible, as if it had been written in English from the very beginning, like of the earth. And so I think that is something just to be really sensitive to. And I saw another question just about how do we encourage students to be sensitive to these absences or gaps. I think, without necessarily forcing everyone to become some sort of card-carrying archivist or something. Not that I myself an archivist, properly so called. I think one thing is just to even sort of draw attention. Try to find little moments where one can draw attention to ways in which a text contains a trace of, not to sort of fall into Derridean language, but sort of contains a trace of the absent thing, a trace of the thing that is no longer there, as a way of sort of opening up that world. There's actually a lot of really wonderful work that's been done by a scholar, a historian named Kelly Hernandez at UCLA, on the rebel archive in the age of mass incarceration, and the way that reliance on state archives to study this kind of can replicate a form of erasure, and how do we study archives that the state itself engaged in a process of destroying. And so I think that just trying to really sort of encourage students to be sensitive to this, but also one of the things I like to remind students of is that the idea that this wasn't occurring, or that is not a kind of novel idea in some sense. So I sort of just was, as David was and Erika were speaking, there's a famous quote that the great early modern Marxist historian Christopher Hill was fond of recalling, that had been made, I think, by William Blake, about how nothing can be more contemptible than to suppose that public records or archives tell the truth. So the idea that, like, in a sense, you should expect an archive or a library to just kind of give you unvarnished truth in toto, that is actually the kind of novel assumption. And so in a way, trying to work backwards to an awareness that archives are constructed, texts are constructed, and that anytime you construct something, some things get retained and some things get jettisoned. And that is the process of making anything. And so trying to then, make students aware of that. It doesn't actually, and then hopefully, I guess, it's one of the things I try to show in my talk, that doesn't, the upshot of that doesn't have to just be a terrible message of loss, though it can be, but can be the beginning of a process of recovery.
Yeah, and just quickly to follow up on that, that point is that while many things have been lost, many things have also not been lost, but have been obscured by our bibliographic methodologies, and the choice to focus on and privilege some kinds of texts over other kinds of texts, some kinds of archives over other kinds of archives. So we're still rethinking what it means to engage with an archive, what it means to engage with the margins of archives, and how new methodologies such as experiencing the full sensorium of the archive that David is working with yield information that was secret or hidden, supposedly, and is now, has been available all along.
All right, well, on that point, that seems perfect a perfect place to end. And I just, again, wanted to thank Gabby and Lori for really making this possible. It's fantastic, and it's just a pleasure. Thank you so much to Professor Brian Cordell, to Professor Erika Boeckler, and of course, I know you're an associate professor, that it must just have been a slip of the tongue I didn't even notice, so I'm feeling guilty. To David Medina, and to Professor Jeff Miller for joining us. There are about 50 of us still here. I think we'll just say, if anyone would like to come join us for coffee in about 3 minutes so that people can actually get their coffee, or use the restroom, or mind a child in the other room. Gabby has dropped a link in the chat there that you can just cut and paste for yourself, hopefully, and we'll see you there. But this has been just delightful, and I'm so grateful to all of you for this wonderful opportunity. So thank you
so much, Sari. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.